Hello, my name is Kirk McKenzie, the founder of Defend Rural America. I am gravely concerned about the direction our country and indeed our world are going in, and determined to do what I can to get back on track. The topic today is America's future. We have two paths, submission or restoration. We discuss the problems, the causes, and the solutions. In terms of the problems, my observations, let's take a look first at water. In the San Joaquin Valley, formerly the breadbasket of the world, we see that the water is being turned off. It's gone from 100% allocation to 80% to 60% to 40%. Nonetheless, the farmers are being charged for 100%. This year, in 2013, the allocations were cut to 20 to 35%. And because 300 3-inch smelt, or about 5 to 10 pounds of fish, were found in the pump, they cut the water off entirely. 800,000 acre-feet of water, enough for 800,000 families, irrigation for 200,000 acres, 20 million tons of grapes, or thousands of jobs, was shipped directly to the ocean, bypassing the agricultural lands. San Joaquin Valley is simply becoming the Death Valley. This is a photograph I took on driving on Interstate 5, where you see an orchard standing there, formerly vibrant trees that are now completely dead and desiccated. Those leaves on there are completely dry. I see the destruction of trees and orchards, businesses, jobs, property values, and food. In terms of dams, Klamath River dams, there's a proposal to destroy all 4 of them. The Klamath River Basin consists of 9 counties, 2 states, and an area that's larger than the state of Maryland. If those dams are destroyed, the lakes that are behind them, the reservoirs, will be destroyed as long as the water, the habitat, will see a restoration of flooding and drought, and the loss of energy production that serves 60,000 homes. The way this to be accomplished, the Klamath Basin Restoration Agreement is a proposed management plan put together by a group of stakeholders. Stakeholders that invented a term to be an alternative to constituents. Anybody can be a stakeholder under this plan. This particular plan consists of government agencies, special interests, including ones in Portland, Oregon, and a non-native tribe, all of whom are saying, we know how to govern this land, and they're going to the federal government saying, charter us and we'll do it. Should that occur, you have governance by remote control. People who live there don't matter anymore, nor does local government. Here's the photograph or a video of the destruction of Condit Dam. Here's the explosion, and we can see shooting out of the dam is not just water, but accumulated sediments. The argument being made is that this is somehow healthy for the river and for the species. What's left over is a big dirt gulch, destruction of the lakes, destruction of riparian habitat, and destruction of property values. How would you like to have those cabins on what was once formerly lakefront property? There is an agenda to destroy the dams across the nation. This is one such map, a little dated. More than 1,000 dams have been destroyed, with plans to destroy thousands more, including even the mighty dams that are on the Columbia River, or even some discussion of Hoover Dam. In addition, there's water battles in western Montana. There's an area in the western watershed that encompasses 11 counties, and a battle over who owns the senior water rights. Those water rights were long settled in law and go back to the 1800s. Nonetheless, they're being challenged under new interpretations of a treaty with the Flathead Indian tribe, who has a reservation in the middle of this, saying that because they have fishing rights, that all of those waters, the inflow, all the streams and rivers around the lake, their Flathead Lake, belong to them. Here is the White River Watershed Blueway that encompasses approximately 1/3 of the states of Arkansas and Missouri. You can see in the shaded area a takeover. And what's relevant about these are not federal lands. These are private lands. Statehood is not a total solution. Jurisdiction is the key. In terms of agriculture, here's an article about the intention to purchase or acquire control of 3 million acres of Montana, set that aside as American Prairie Reserve, destroying communities, farms, ranching, and so forth in order to have 250 free roaming bison. In terms of forests, the forests are not being managed. The trees continue to grow, but there's no more any harvesting of those trees. So the trees become very dense, almost like weeds in your yard when you don't mow. They get so close together, they're fighting for water, they're fighting for sunlight. The trees become thin, weak, subject to a lot of bug infestations, and they obviously have a lot of fuel building up. A lot of twigs, branches, and so forth that are building up in very dense canopies. This simply is not a healthy way for forests to be. A healthy forest looks more like this. More open, blue sky because the canopy is not completely closed off. And you notice that there's a lack of the fuels on the floor of the forest. Those forests are sustainable. This one has a picture of a forest fire. It doesn't look like a forest fire because it is properly managed. The fire was unable to leap up into the canopies and become a horrific fire. So after about 100 yards or so, this fire went out all by itself. Compare that to that kind of a fire. Nearly all of the western states in the last 10 years have recorded record fires. They have become catastrophic fires because of the fuel buildups. These fires have an intensity that reaches 2,000 degrees, and they can even generate their own weather, with winds up to 200 miles per hour. There is a fire in Lake Tahoe. The result of all these fires is death. These are the 19 hotshots that died outside of Prescott, Arizona. I was there traveling at the time. Destroying property. They're absolutely burning animals alive. An estimate is there are about 3 animals per acre, or if a 500,000 acre fire burns, you're talking about 1.5 million animals that are incinerated. This includes chipmunks and squirrels and skunks, fox, deer, antelope, elk, and yes, even endangered species like the spotted owl or frogs and toads. The fires are so devastating that the trees have become literally just standing matchsticks, completely burned and turned into carbon. After these fires, the rains have nothing to stop them. They go ahead and begin to destroy the habitat through soil erosion. They cause flooding. Here is an article about the recent catastrophe in Boulder, Colorado. The downpour has caused flash floods throughout the Boulder area and killed 2 people. One factor has made the flooding considerably worse: the wildfires that have stricken the forest in the region in the past few years. And of course, the sediments then flow into our water streams and our rivers, which are massive violations of the Clean Water Act. Those fires also generate horrific amount of particles, more than human activity, and those particles are far worse. These are the 2.5 micron and smaller particles that get in our lungs and stay there. Massive violations of the Clean Air Act. In addition, those trees are taking water that would normally go to agriculture. Not only do they suck it up from the soil, but the canopies, when they get so dense, the snow falls there, it stays there, and evaporates back into the air before it has a chance to melt and become water in the ground system. The impact on California is estimated to be, based upon actual scientific study, 1 to 2 million acre feet of water that would otherwise be available for growing food. In terms of recreation, whether we're talking about national parks, wilderness areas, wetlands, monuments, national grasslands, we're increasingly seeing the public is being denied access to public lands, where it's for hiking, camping, fishing, hunting, off-roading, swimming. Increasingly, the roads are being closed and sealed off in areas that we once enjoyed are no longer accessible to us. In terms of energy, 40% of our country's energy comes from coal. We have proven reserves of 486 billion short tons. Nonetheless, new clean air standards have been put forward. The old ones were met, and they had 10 to 20 years to meet them. It was painful and expensive, but they were met. Under the Obama administration, those standards were increased multiple fold, and they were given 6 to 9 months to comply. Wasn't technically possible, wasn't economically feasible, so coal plants in the United States, many of them now, major coal production facilities, are shutting down. We have 1.442 trillion barrels of proven oil reserves. Those are being put off limit by lizards, buffalo, bugs, and grass. We have 2.744 quadrillion cubic feet of natural gas, likewise being put off limits. We have hydropower dams, which is the cleanest, most renewable, and cheapest energy around. There's no fuel being burned. The water flows in, the water flows out. It's a perpetual cycle. Absolutely clean, very dependable. Those dams are being destroyed. In terms of nuclear energy, we have plenty of uranium deposits. Nonetheless, 48% of our uranium deposits are in a place called the North Arizona Strip, likewise being closed down due to listings. In their place, we're being told that solar is the solution. Solar is about 10 times more expensive. It's very inefficient. It takes about 100 to 1,000 times more land than an equivalent hydropower dam would take to generate the same amount of electricity. And the impact. It's obvious that they do impact open space, watershed, wetlands, habitat, and even those bugs, lizards, and grass. Likewise, we're being told the solution is wind farms. Kind of a schizophrenic policy where we say we don't want to have too many highway signs blocking our view. Nonetheless, we're now giving away prime land on our horizon to these ugly things. Not only did they destroy our view, they kill eagles and other birds, and they definitely have an impact on open space. In terms of mining, this is a suction dredge miner, a very small mining operation compared to what we normally think. This is the mainstream mining operation these days, relatively benign if it's done properly. They have legal rights to do so, nonetheless, the legal rights are being taken away. Conclusions. We are in a crisis. Rural America is failing. Some 30% of the nation's counties are near economic ruin. In fact, rural America is being conquered. This destruction is destruction to our health, through reduced air quality, water quality, food quality. More stress, more health problems, more spousal, child, and elderly abuse. In terms of safety, we have more property damage, more drug cartels and drug production. When the forests are closed off to commercial and recreational use, the drug cartels move in, as we discovered in Northern California and Southern Oregon. Substance abuse goes up, crime goes up, and we have reduced firefighting ability. In terms of welfare, fewer jobs, closing businesses, declining county budgets and services, less and more expensive energy. We have less access to and use of natural resources, and the children without jobs are moving away, declining school enrollments. We have more welfare based upon printing of money out of thin air, and more dependence. The environment, we see increased forest densification and forest fires, and desertification, which we'll talk more about. Loss of our forests, and loss of our animals, habitat, water and air quality, and fish hatcheries. In terms of recreation, as we discussed, more land closures and less public access to enjoy the things that we enjoy and enjoy all those open spaces. We furthermore see the killing off of species, death by incineration, death by being eaten alive by predatory animals such as wolves and lions that are being released, death by habitat destruction, including the death of endangered species. We furthermore see the expulsion of humans, human activities, and human progress. All of this is being done under the label of habitat restoration. There are two competing visions going forward. Ours is based upon the American dream, liberty, home ownership, being king of your castle, the American dream. Theirs is based upon destruction. Theirs is based upon a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, with the people as the sovereigns. Their belief is that out of date. It needs to be replaced. Our belief in representing democracy through constituents, their belief in stakeholders. Anybody can have any say over anywhere. Our belief in free will, their belief in central planning. Our belief in government, theirs in governance, which we'll talk more about. Sovereignty versus dependence, and security versus disarmament. Our dream is fading and will continue to fade unless we begin to fight back more effectively. What's causing a lot of these problems? Neo-Environmentalism. That is the first and foremost cause. And I'm not talking about environmentalism here. The people who live in rural America don't go there for fame or fortune. They do this because it's a life quality decision. They like the outdoors. They like the open space. They are generally good stewards of the land. Farmers, ranchers, foresters. What's happening, though, is the environmental movement is being captured, infiltrated by a bunch of radicals. Neo-environmentalism. Neo-environmentalism is a political movement. It's simply cloaked in green. It's now environmentalist versus neo-environmentalist. And it's not about party affiliation. It's not about left versus right, conservative versus liberal. It's about right versus wrong. Neo-environmentalists are domestic terrorists. Places like the Center for Biological Diversity, which is in fact a large law firm, have intentionally filed a blitzkrieg of listings, hundreds more to come. We're used to weapons of mass destruction being things like nuclear weapons. We're not used to the idea that other weapons of mass destruction are causing far more harm to us than can be caused by conventional weapons. The new ones of legislation, taken to the extreme. I happen to have grown up in the day when the Clean Air Act was passed, and I lived in Pasadena as a child where the smog was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Couldn't see for more than 100 yards on some days. You began to breathe very shallow. It was even so detrimental and caustic that it would actually chew into rubber waders after a period of 3 to 4 years. Something had to be done, and the Clean Air Act was a good solution. Those standards have been met. What's now happening is the legislation is being used for political purposes. The Endangered Species Act is an example. As we're led to believe, it's about the extinction of major species. Starting with the original one that was justifying all this was the American bald eagle. In fact, it has to do with geographic pockets. The coho salmon, for example, exists in the millions. The only argument being made here is the Klamath River basin, there's not enough 200 miles upstream. In other words, they're just talking about pockets of populations, not about extinction. Furthermore, it's no longer about species. Species, if two can mate and have viable young, they're the same species. They may vary when they geographically disperse. Some develop yellow spots, some develop red spots. Nonetheless, they're the same species. But what's being called species are in fact mutations. And these mutations are getting to be like yellow versus red spots, or even finer. They're now using microscopes to try and find some kind of a variance, or even DNA testing. If apply that standard to the human race, we'd have blondes and brunettes, or two different species. We thought it was about animals. Well, it includes bugs and grasses. We thought it was about species restoration. In fact, there is no plans or objectives anywhere in the Endangered Species Act or these environmental impact statements to restore species. It's simply to restore habitat, essentially the expulsion of humans. It's basically land and resources grab. We thought it was supposed to be based on science. And in fact, as we'll talk about more, It's increasingly based upon Google searches to find proxy data, data, not actually measurements, but just proxy data, or computer simulations based upon secret models and data sets that won't be released, or satellite images. That's called the best available science. We would think it would be based upon quantitative targets. How many is enough? How many is too few? How many do we need to have to say they're no longer extinct? No such quantitative targets or definitions exist. As soon as the habitat is restored, in other words, the humans are removed, the goal has been accomplished, whether or not the species actually comes back or not. We would believe that they're supposed to be native species of their native lands. In fact, the species like the wolf that's being introduced in the United States comes from Canada. It's not the gray wolf that was here originally. Or that we were supposed to be restoring species to their native locations. In fact, remarkably, we've learned that their position is that any land that qualifies as habitat is okay whether the species actually ever existed there. You find that in the case of a proposed frogs and toads listing in California. We would think that in making these calculations, they would consider all the land and all the animals, and in fact, they don't. They exclude the national lands. So when they say a species is endangered, they're not taking into account the species may be doing just fine in the national parks, the national monuments, and the national wetlands, and so on. As soon as a species habitat gets designated for one species, it no longer is counted for future species listings. Likewise, you would think they would consider all animals, but as we discovered in the case of the Klamath River Basin, they refuse to count the 6 million salmon that are being produced in a fish hatchery because they're psychologically different. The Endangered Species Act is currently being used as a hostile takeover and the abolition of property and property rights. It amounts to serial plunder, one species at a time. The Equal Access to Justice Act was passed so that small people could actually find a day in court suing the federal government, and if they were right and prevailed, they could get their costs back to the tune of $125 an hour for attorney fees. In practice, it's now large law firms such as the Sierra Club, who has a big legal department. They're charging hourly rates of $650 an hour or so, and they don't prevail in court. They just threaten to sue, and the federal government just collapses and says, we're going to settle outside of the court, in a practice called sue and settle. These settlement agreements are often secret, and the whole process is biased so that 90% or so of these EJF funds go to one side, not the other. This is a letter written on June 26, 2013 by 4 congressional representatives: David Vitter, Ranking Member, Committee on Environment and Public Works; John Boozman, Ranking Member, Subcommittee on Water and Wildlife; Jim Inhofe, Ranking Member, Subcommittee on Oversight; and Jeff Sessions, Ranking Member, Subcommittee on Clean Air. They're asking for a copy of the secret settlement agreements, which are not even being given to Congress, nor even to the congressional leaders that oversee these activities. Scientific fraud is another weapon of mass destruction, and we're going to discuss several instances of this. In the case of the spotted owl, which was listed in 1990 and 1992, it was originally put in Northern California and Southern Oregon. It's a proven failure. Indications are that the owl continues to decline at a rate of 3.5% per year, at least according to some individuals. The solution? They shut off more of the Pacific forest, going all the way up to the boundary of Canada. Virtually all Pacific coastal forests are now shut off to human activities like logging, as indicated in the yellow. Spotted owls are not a species. They're a mutation. The species is not endangered or threatened. Barred owls are the same species. They can mate and have successful young. They're doing just fine. And what's going on is a process of natural selection. Nonetheless, the claim is that this is threatening the spotted owls, and so they're going, and the latest move is to begin to kill the barred owls. It's as if you have to kill the brunettes so they don't mate with the blondes and produce redheads. All they want is bronze. This is confirmed in a letter or an article written by Dr. Bob Zyback, questioning the science, questioning the applicability of computer simulations instead of actual measurements, indicating there's no correlation between the owl populations and the habitat that's been designated, and the cost to the communities has been billions of dollars. Economic hardships, family hardships, lost jobs across the board. Now there's a proposed listing of frogs and toads that will now span into the eastern forests in California, the Sierra Nevada forests. It would encompass 2 million acres, 14 counties, and 9 forests, and completely surround Yosemite, as we'll see in a moment. The actual cause, there is a decline worldwide of frogs and toads, and this decline is occurring even in pristine wilderness areas where there are no human beings. It's primarily due to a fungus carried by an African clod frog that was imported to the United States for pregnancy testing. Secondarily, by trout plantings in the upper lakes. Trout were no doubt introduced there for recreational purpose and also to take care of the mosquitoes and other disease-causing phenomena. Habitat is not the problem, nor is it the solution. And yet that is the direction that the Endangered Species Act inevitably goes. And we have revelations that we've talked about before. The problem exists in pristine areas. These listings cover not just, quote, public lands, but private property. The property being designated does not have to be original native habitat. And they're not counting areas that are already available for the species. This is a map of Tuolumne County, and the purples, the pinks, the yellows are all areas that are being designated as habitat. In the bottom right corner of Tuolumne County on the right-hand side, the gray area is Yosemite Valley, and immediately surrounding, completely surrounding that are these designated areas, meaning that human activity like hiking and camping and so forth are likely to be very dramatically reduced or regulated. In terms of the Klamath River dams, turns out the coho salmon are not endangered. It's simply that El Nino warmed up the coast of the United States, the Pacific coast. The salmon like it cold, so they've kind of migrated north to Alaska, where there are millions of them. They also travel across the oceans to Japan and Korea. They've been successfully installed in reservoirs throughout the United States and the Great Lakes. Nonetheless, the proposal is to blow up these dams under that pretense. That will also destroy a fish hatchery that produces 6 million salmon a year. And it's going to release 20 million cubic yards of accumulated sediments. That's equal to 1 foot deep on a 2-lane road for a distance of 1,600 miles. Do quite a number on this river. We also see scientific fraud in a liberal county, here in Marin County in California. The proposal is to remove or shut down a business, the Drakes Bay Oyster Farm, that's been there since the 1950s. One of the individuals who became engaged in the battle to look at the science, the alleged science behind this, was Dr. Corey Goodman, a member of the National Academy of Sciences and a well-respected venture capitalist. He has studied the information and flat out has called it scientific fraud. One of the elements is they propose that oysters have to be removed because they poop too much. Or proxy data. The argument is that this business operation is making so much noise that it's disrupting the raising of seal pups 1.5 miles away. Two of the examples. One of those is they have, at the business, they have a plastic pipe with slots of varying sizes on it, rotated by a 1/2 horsepower electric motor. The oysters go in and they drop out by size. The claim is this is making too much noise. But the actual data that shows up on the table, without any indication, suggesting that it's from this oyster soda, is actually taken from a military cement mixer, steel, turning rocks. Or they say that this little gas engine on a little boat they have, about 10-20 horsepower gas engine. Likewise is making too much noise, but the data is taken from a New Jersey police measurement of a jet ski boat. In fact, there's been no actual measurements taken at Drake's Bay Oyster Farm. Dr. Corey Goodman, as so many other people have concluded, it's not about the science, it's all about a predetermined outcome and continuing to fraudulently represent information knowingly, willfully, and continuously in order to achieve the outcome.
The Park Service supporters love leaking out and claiming that, that I've been paid or I'm this or I'm that. I've never been paid a penny. Everything I'm going to tell you now, I've done pro bono in my spare time, and I've done it simply because I've been outraged by what I've seen my federal government do. I've been outraged by what looks to me to be a repeated pattern of intentional misrepresentation of science.
Another example is the Delta smell issue eventually reached the court. Quote, and the judge, hearing the case, quote, angered by testimony from the two scientists that he said was false, contradictory, and misleading, an attempt to mislead and to deceive the court into accepting not only what is not the best science, it's not science. And cattle, which are under attack by the release of wolves and numerous other approaches, generally being talked about as being wicked and evil and terrible and something you have to eliminate. Let's hear what Alan Savory has to say about that.
The most massive tsunami, perfect storm is bearing down upon us. Desertification is a fancy word for land that is turning to desert. We have environments where we have months of humidity followed by months of dryness, and that is where desertification is occurring. Generally, what you see in green is not desertifying, and what you see in brown is. And these are by far the greatest areas of the Earth. About 2/3, I would guess, of the world is desertifying. We know that desertification is caused by livestock, mostly cattle, sheep, and goats, overgrazing the plants, leaving the soil bare and giving off methane. Almost everybody knows this, from Nobel laureates to golf caddies, or was taught it, as I was. Well, I have news for you. We were once just as certain that the world was flat. We were wrong then, and we are wrong again. When I came to the United States, I got a shock to find national parks like this one desertifying as badly as anything in Africa. Clearly, we have never understood what is causing desertification, which has destroyed many civilizations and now threatens us globally. But I have for you a very simple message that offers more hope than you can imagine. This picture is a typical seasonal grassland. It has just come through 4 months of rain, and it's now going into 8 months of dry season. And watch the change as it goes into this long dry season. Now, all of that grass you see above ground has to decay biologically before the next growing season. And if it doesn't, the grassland and the soil begin to die. To prevent that, we have traditionally used fire. But fire also leaves the soil bare, releasing carbon. And worse than that, burning 1 hectare of grassland gives off more and more damaging pollutants than 6,000 cars. We cannot burn it without causing desertification and climate change. What are we going to do? There is only one option. I repeat to you, only one option left to climatologists and scientists, and that is to do the unthinkable and to use livestock, bunched and moving, as a proxy for former herds and predators and mimic nature. There is no other alternative left to mankind. So let's do that. So on this bit of grassland, we'll do it, but just in the foreground. We'll impact it very heavily with cattle to mimic nature, and we've done so, and look at that. All of that grass is now covering the soil as dung, urine, and litter or mulch, as every one of the gardeners amongst you would understand, and that soil is ready to absorb and hold the rain, to store carbon, and to break down methane. And we did that without using fire to damage the soil, and the plants are free to grow. This is land close to land that we manage in Zimbabwe. It has just come through 4 months of very good rains it got that year, and it's going into the long dry season. But as you can see, all of that rain, almost all of it, has evaporated from the soil surface. Their river is dry despite the rain just having ended. Okay, and we have 150,000 people on almost permanent food aid. Now let's go to our land nearby on the same day with the same rainfall, and look at that. Our river is flowing and healthy and clean. It's fine. The production of grass, shrubs, trees, wildlife, everything is now more productive, and we have virtually no fear of dry years. And we did that by increasing the cattle and goats 400%. Millions of men, women, and children are suffering and dying. And if this continues, we are unlikely to be able to stop the climate changing even after we have eliminated the use of fossil fuels. I believe I've shown you how we can work with nature at very low cost to reverse all this. We are already doing so on about 15 million hectares on 5 continents. I can think of almost nothing that offers more hope for our planet, for your children, and their children, and all of humanity. Thank you.
Who would know? As it turns out, the cattle are critical to the habitat. They are nature's farmers. They till the soil, fertilize it, and harvest the crop. Sage grouse listing is another example. Based upon the research of Professor Emeritus Wayne Burkhart, University of Nevada, Reno, and actually 3rd years of actual field research, turns out the sage grouse main threats are not humans or surface disturbance, but instead cheatgrass and wildfires. And the third most detrimental threat is predators, namely ravens, coyotes, and badgers. Once again, it's not human activity, nor is it habitat. Another weapon of mass destruction will be talked about separately in a moment. That's governance and central planning. And finally, agencyism. Agency is an interesting word. Agents for whom? Because they certainly have not been formed to protect us. They've been formed to control us. And there is no due process. They have administrative, not constitutional law, administrative, not constitutional courts, and decisions by administrators, not jurors. Just as envisioned by Colonel Edward Mandell House, who was President Woodrow Wilson's handler. So how do we solve these problems? First, we have to admit that we are losing. And we won't win repeating what we've been doing. The people must take the lead. Government at every level has been tainted and affected in some way. The people have to get off the bleachers and onto the field. Too much of this view that this is a football game. We elect a sheriff, we elect a few supervisors, and they're supposed to carry the battle forward on our behalf while we watch. It won't work. It hasn't been working. It's time that we have to get off those bleachers. We have to get down there in the fight, pushing, pulling, working side by side, defending, but moving forward. Defend Rural America is an all-volunteer movement. It has a complete package: education, strategies, tactics, training, and organizing. Purely voluntary support, grassroots, bottoms up, organized by county. It's nonpartisan. Strongly believe that we cannot win if we continue our defensive strategies. All we can do is slow down the losses. In order to win, we have to go on the offense, and we have to focus. And we have to focus on issues that are critical. Too much of the time, we're focusing on issues that are symptoms of deeper problems. We must address the deeper issues. Current efforts are to take on the neo-environmentalism head-on, to reopen the forest and start responsible management, a program called the Constitutional County, and to restore local government, that is, representative government. First, to take on the Endangered Species Act through public education, as we've started in this particular presentation. Secondarily, the counties must engage. They must understand that their authority is also an obligation and a duty to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the constituents, and that the greatest threat to that is, in fact, neo-environmentalism. The people's money has to be used on behalf of the people for a change. We're taking on the Frogs and Toads listing here in California through a series of events. Not only are we fighting the act, but we're using this as an opportunity to learn and to get moving forward on a unified front. Long term, each county needs to erect a permanent shield against these listings because they're not stopping, and there's hundreds more to come. It needs to be funded, and I believe that the counties can do this cost effectively because they can cost share across multiple counties. Towards the end of taking these on and writing authoritative commentary, we're going to have events here, training classes for the few who are serious, October 24th and October 26th, 2013 here in California. Second, reopen the forests. 2 resolutions that we want the county boards to approve. First is declare a state of emergency. Openly acknowledge that the counties are failing and will fail. This is not an ambiguous result. We know where the direction this is going to go. Openly acknowledge there's a state of emergency, and secondarily authorize and direct the sheriff to reopen those roads in the forests and to start the reharvesting programs. Start with a pilot forest management program, work out the bugs, get it to work, and then expand. All under the county's authority and obligation to defend the health, safety, and welfare of its people. Third is the idea of a constitutional county, which encompasses a great deal of information beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. We'll focus only on that part which is relevant to today's discussion. Founding principles of this country. In the United States, sovereignty resides in the people who act through the organs established by the Constitution. The Congress cannot invoke the sovereign power of the people to override their will, as thus declared. Sovereignty resides in the people. What a remarkable idea. For mankind's almost entire history, the people have been subordinated to one ruler or another, under one guise or another. The United States was founded on another principle. It is the people who are in charge. The government of the people, by the people, for the people. The people are sovereign. The Constitution is a declaration, we the people. It is not a contract. It requires no approval of the federal government. The federal government, in fact, is brought into existence by the authorization of the people acting as a whole. It establishes a federation of states to work together on limited enumerated purposes of common interest. It is an organization chart with job descriptions. Article 1 defines the legislative authorities, and this is the article that establishes the powers and the limitations of the federal government. Articles 2 and 3 define an executive and the judicial to enforce and protect, and a Bill of Rights that affirms that those limitations are real, that they are enumerated powers and nothing beyond that. We are not a nation, we are a federation. It's the United States of America are, not the United States of America is. Capitol Hill is a meeting place for sovereign countries, meeting in Congress, to work out things of common interest. The states are sovereign countries, nonetheless they're acting like counties. And part of the problem is this, the Pledge of Allegiance, which I have proudly given for my entire lifetime, solemnly, in great belief. I now believe that's part of the poison pill. Let's consider perhaps a better Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of these United States and to the republic for which they stand, one federation, under God, with liberty and justice for all. And with the flag that does not have a fringe. Jurisdiction is part of the constitutional county, but because it's an important topic, we'll discuss it as a separate one. Here is a picture of, or a conceptualization of all land in the United States. When our country was formed, it was a response to centuries of feudalism. The idea that a few people in the land and everybody else worked for them. Everybody else was essentially a serf in indentured servitude. The idea in this country would be that the people as sovereigns would own the land. It wouldn't belong to the king, it would belong to the people. Either as public land under collective ownership or as private property under individual ownership. And it was the policy to convert the public lands into private property. More about that in a moment. So jurisdiction over public lands. Before we can get into an intelligent discussion, we have to clarify a few things that are quite often confused. There are different roles. Who owns the lands? Who's the trustee? The legislative authority and jurisdiction. Who owns the public lands? The public, the people, the sovereigns. Who's the trustee of these public lands? The federal government. Who has legislative authority? That's according to the Constitution. And jurisdiction. Juris, like jurisprudence, refers to the courts. The Constitution does not specifically enumerate the powers of the courts, so they had to decide what was their authority, and the logic concluded that they have authority where there's legislative authority. Conversely, no legislative authority, no court authority. That then follows legislative authority. The federal zone, we can define where the federal government will use this term, has some interest in land. And perhaps one of the most important parts of the Constitution, and the most abused. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 specifies the nature under which the federal government has exclusive legislative authority over land. First is for 10 square miles to be ceded by the appropriate states, Virginia and Maryland, which became the District of Columbia. And second, for purchases of land from the states with their consent for enumerated purposes. And this enumeration of purposes is important as any other limitation on the federal government. And those enumerated purposes? The erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings, basically for self-defense. There's nothing in here about national parks, national forests, national grasslands, or anything of that nature. The lands that are purchased for constitutional purposes under this clause are called federal enclaves. And under Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2, there's reference to U.S. possessions, which now is Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Guam, and American Samoa. The federal zone, then, consists of Washington, D.C., the federal enclaves, the possessions, and the territories, all of which are less than about 3% of the nation's country, of land. Territories have all been converted to states, so that no longer is a consideration. Laws passed by the U.S. Congress for the federal zone are called municipal law. Municipal law is law that a government passes that has to do with its internal jurisdiction. The federal government has then basically two hats that it wears. The exclusive legislation granted to it by the Constitution over the federal zone, municipal law, and general law, which falls under the rest of the Constitution, which applies broadly. The United States never held any municipal sovereignty, jurisdiction, or right of soil in and to the territory of which Alabama or any of the new states were formed, except for temporary purposes and to execute the trust created. All legislation is prima facie territorial. Legislation is presumptively territorial and confined to limits over which the lawmaking power has jurisdiction. Legislation of Congress, unless a contrary intent appears, is meant to apply only within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. In other words, the federal zone. Federal legislation does not apply to sovereigns, sovereign states, or sovereign state lands. Furthermore, federal purchases of public lands from states for non-enumerated purposes, from organizations such as the Center for Biological Diversity, or from individuals, are unconstitutional, even if the states consent. Where Congress exceeds its authority relative to the states, the departure from the constitutional plan cannot be ratified by the consent of state officials. The constitutional authority of Congress cannot be expanded by the consent of the governmental unit whose domain is thereby narrowed, whether that unit is the executive branch or the states. Where rights secured by the Constitution are involved, there can be no rulemaking or legislation which would abrogate them. In 1962 was published a report commonly called the Eisenhower Report, after President Eisenhower. This report came out long after the enabling acts for most states, whereby the states ceded any title to the public lands within the state borders. It categorizes all federal land interests into 5 categories. Category 1 is exclusive legislative authority for the federal government. 2, 3 are mixed legislative authority. 4 is exclusively state, which we'll come back to in a moment. And 5 is unknown. Category 4 is called proprietary interest only, and the definition: the federal government has acquired some right or title to an area in a state, but has not obtained any measure of the state's authority over the area. 95% of that 2/3 of western United States, which we call federal lands, falls into Category 4. In other words, they're not federal lands, nor are they properly federally managed lands. These maps, which represent in red, labeled federal land, are wrong and very misleading. States and countries have jurisdiction over national forests, states and counties. They have the authority and the duty to defend the health, safety, and welfare of their constituents, and none other. They're not there to represent or to enforce the federal laws. They're not there to represent stakeholders or special interest groups. They're not there to do any of that. They're there solely as representatives of their constituents. Within any state of this union, the preservation of the peace and the protection of person and property are the functions of the state government. The state government. And are not part of the primary duty, at least, of the nation. In other words, the federal government. They're telling you flat out, the protection of person and property is not our job. That's the job of the states. Furthermore, go on to say, the laws of Congress in respect to these matters, in other words, protection of person and property, do not extend into the territorial limits of the states, but have force only in the District of Columbia and other places that are within the exclusive jurisdiction of the national government. In other words, the federal zone. Once challenged, jurisdiction cannot be assumed. It must be proved to exist. And I strongly suggest it's time for us to begin to challenge federal jurisdiction across the board. And they must prove that they have jurisdiction. They cannot dismiss this. They must prove it. And that proof will be difficult to come by. Interestingly, from the California Constitution, 2 clauses here. The first is the very first after the preamble, Section 1, Article 1. All people are by nature free and independent and have inalienable rights. Among these are enjoying and defending life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and pursuing and obtaining safety, happiness, and privacy. In Article 1, Section 7A, a person may not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law or denied equal protection of the laws. So let's consider jurisdiction now over private property. The founding principle was that in order to be a free man, you needed to have a freehold. Therefore, the objective was to turn public land into private property, and this was accomplished through land patents. These are documents that were signed by the president in office at the time. All private property in the United States, ranches, farms, homes, all private property is connected to a land patent. Going back to our map, we can see the process from going from public lands to private property was the issuance of these land patents. And they're generally issued for free. Like the Homestead Act, the condition was that you would get your 20 acres and a mule, provided that you show that you can work this land and you're serious about doing that for a period of time. The whole idea was to build debt-free private property, or freeholds. Here is a sample land patent, an actual one signed by President William McKinley in 1901, containing wording that's similar or almost identical to all the others. Now know ye, that there is therefore granted by the United States, unto the said person, the tract of land above described, to have and to hold the said tract of land with the appurtenances thereof, unto the said subject, or said person, and to his heirs and assigns forever. Therefore granted unto the said person and to his heirs and assigns forever. Forever means forever. The idea is that once the public land had been converted to private property, it was to remain private property. An excellent presentation on this is the interview that I did with Ron Gibson. You can find the Defend Rural America website to learn more. Now let's consider this private property. The states have cleared title through the enabling acts and thus are not in the chain of title. The federal government has granted title forever, and the people are sovereign, unto whom all land belongs, except perhaps for the exclusive legislative authority of the federal government over federal enclaves. An appropriate question, therefore, does either have the right of eminent domain, or in fact are the people the kings of their private property? Returning to the map, what I see happening is the federal government engaged in an unconstitutional and unlawful expansion to try and take control of our public lands and our private property under the argument that wherever the air blows, the water flows, the grass grows, or animals roam, is federal. There is another nation that had a similar philosophy, and I stand strongly in the position that we need to have the restoration and to peel this back and restore the founding principles. Now there are other approaches, and I'm going to propose a unified strategy. In column A, I'm going to list statehood, the approach being taken by Utah, separation, the approach being taken or considered by Northern California, Southern Oregon, and Colorado to form new states, coordination, and congressional legislation. In column B, I'm going to put jurisdiction. And the reason for this distinction is that in column A has one thing in common across all of them: federal approval. In other words, in order to move forward on any of those, we must seek the cooperation of the very problem that we're seeking. The federal government is not the solution as much as it is the problem. Column B is not. It is based strongly, centered right on the Constitution and legal decisions such as I've shown you already. It simply requires the people and their representatives to understand the Constitution and then to support it. So the unified strategy for those that pursue the other alternatives is I believe that they must incorporate jurisdiction into their thinking and their ideas and their programs. And once they understand what jurisdiction is, I believe they will come to the same conclusion as I, that it accomplished most of what you want. So what's holding us back? Our view is the people are at the top. We send our property taxes and our votes to control the county. The county then does the role that we have for government, which is policy and enforcement, the two roles of government. In fact, here's the reality. The people have been pushed to the bottom, and here's how that is accomplished. Property taxes no longer go to the county. The county has been deprived of their tax revenues from the counties, from the people. Instead, they go to the state. The state will send money to the county, but only on certain conditions. Grants for specific programs. If you build high-speed rail, we will give you money. If you build stack and pack housing, we will give you money. If you go ahead and shut down the forest, we will give you money. This is why the grant writer is one of the most important people now in the counties. Essentially, what is happening is the policy has been ripped away and moved up above the county, and the county is now just an enforcer. A form of this is regional plans, whereby land is predetermined and pre-controlled, no longer private property, but all of it subject to certain policies that are being pushed into the counties through these plans. This approach is not new. It was a result of another action taken in 1913, we'll talk about, whereby the federal government allegedly were passing amendments that said that there was a federal income tax. Thereby, the dollars bypassed the states and went directly to the federal government, which has subsequently then used that money to control the states, and now bypassing the states, controlling the counties directly by setting the policies. This model is also now being extended to the United Nations, and for those who are Agenda 21, that's where that fits in. The money, inevitably, no understanding what I did about this, inevitably there must be a direct tax. The United Nations up to this point have been funded primarily by the creation of money from thin air by the Chase Manhattan Bank and the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, or by the federal government. That's not a long-standing relationship. The United Nations will want, in order to become the ultimate power that it wants, a direct tax on the people. It is now moving in that direction by getting a transaction fee on every international transaction, bypassing the federal government, the state government, the county government, money going directly, essentially from the people, to the United Nations. This is where regionalism fits in. Counties or cities forming these regional government bodies that are not constitutional government bodies. This becomes a pocket of money. If you follow those policies, you get some money. If you don't, you don't. Stakeholders, and they're sue and settle. And another corruption is the Service Employee International Union. Amazingly, the courts ruled that that's constitutional, that you could allow the employees of our government to have two bosses. One would be the people, and one would be the unions. This is an obvious conflict of interest. This whole process is called governance, the separation of policy and enforcement of policy. That's why you're not being listened to. Your county commissioners and supervisors are so busy trying to raise money that they really ultimately don't care about your interest. They're prepared to do whatever it takes to sell the authority of their office to the highest bidder. Come back to the model. All this amounts to a central planning. And behind all of this are the international bankers. Here is Amschel Meyer Rothschild around 1790, the father of central banking. Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes the laws. And his son Nathan Rothschild, who took control of the Bank of England. I care not what puppet is placed on the throne of England to rule the empire. The man that controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the money supply. The way that the money flows to the international bankers is through central banking and taxation, essentially the ability to print money out of thin air and to tax the people for its repayment. This was accomplished in the United States in the 1913 Revolution. The allegedly ratified 16th Amendment, which allegedly creates a mandatory federal income tax. The 17th Amendment, which removed the senators. Up until this point, the senators were designated by the state legislatures and more like ambassadors. and therefore the states had a direct control in controlling the federal government through its power of veto. When they went to the popular election of senators, they once again bypassed the states and the Federal Reserve Act. There's another term used for central planning committees, and they're called Soviets. And in fact, one of the founders of Greenpeace refers to neo-environmentalists as watermelons. Green on the outside, red on the inside. For more information about where the whole movement comes from, you can read the report from Iron Mountain or the Rockefeller-financed study published as the Unfinished Agenda, showing how the environmentalism would be used as the green envelope. Here's the reality, and I'm not wanting to point individuals, make accusations, I'm not. We've had a government that's been corrupted. And it's been corrupted for so long we don't even know the difference. But here's the reality. When the state and federal governments take the tax revenues from local governments, it's theft. And then when they basically demand that you go along with their policies in order to get that money back, it's blackmail. And they use it generally to expand their authority beyond constitutional limits. That's an unconstitutional expansion. When county officials take this money, they are violating a lot of laws. A representative is an agent, and their agency laws are very strong, as any broker or realtor will tell you. Once you take on the role of representing another person's interests, you owe them their highest loyalty and a lot of other things. And there's a lot of ways that you can breach that. When county officials use and sell their authority in office for purposes other than what they're there for, they're in breach of fiduciary duty, obvious conflict of interest, self-dealing, when they don't take action like opening up the roads and beginning to manage the forest properly, resulting in damage, they are guilty of negligence. When they try and form regional governments, they're engaged in illegal transfer of authority or operating under color of authority. And to the extent to which they participate in the unconstitutional expansion of federal powers, they're involved in a conspiracy to oppress. While I'm on this subject, let's talk about CalFIR accounts for a moment. This is an independent auditor's report ending June 30th, 2011 for Lincoln County, Montana, the population of 10 to 15,000 people. We find a balance sheet and a statement of net assets on the balance sheet of $48.6 million. But if we go further into the report, into the notes, we discover this page and a table listed security investment type, $2.4 billion. Somewhere between the county, the state, and the federal government is an off-balance sheet slush fund, probably property taxes, that's floating around. This is an ideal thing, in my opinion, for grand juries to investigate. And this happens in every county. This is not just this county. This is nationwide. We're essentially at a point in time where we must restore local government. And I'm talking about representative constitutional government or suffer global governance. We need to elect constitutional sheriffs or super commissioners, district attorneys, county councils, and judges. These are not ordinary times, and we don't need ordinary people. In my opinion, we need to elect patriots, not administrators. What you can do. First, you can support the Defend Rural America effort. For the first time, there is real opportunity to unite. The movement has moved from Northern California throughout about 20 counties in California down south, continuing its expansion, is now expanding into Oregon and Montana, and before long will be in Idaho and Utah. There's a whole sequence of events planned this fall through August and September and November across those areas to bring this program and this information to a wide number of people and representatives, including 2 training sessions on fighting neo-environmentalism, October 24th and October 26th, one in the Fresno area and one in the Gold Country area. You can contribute. So far, this has all been done through volunteer work, and donations, but this geometric expansion of the opportunity requires more money. You can register. Let us know who you are so we can keep in touch with you and get you the information and ask you for support when it's needed. You can study the Defend Rural America website. It's free of subscription, it's free of advertising, and it's free of Google Analytics. Nobody, at least not Google, is tracking your click-throughs on my website. And take the training. Furthermore, show up to those board meetings. Now that you know what the proposal is and what we need to accomplish, stick with it. Endangered Species Act, we need to fight the immediate listing on the day. At the same time, we need to erect a permanent shield. In forest, we need those two resolutions, state of emergency and a resolution to reopen the forest and begin proper management. And finally, to make sure these general plans don't become a policy-making policy to pre-control what the county can do with its own lands. Ultimately, it is your county, your future, your battle, your decision. I cannot do it all for you. I will promise if you support Defend Rural America, I will support you. Thank you for your time.